All right, in this video, I am going to ask a question. Am I the only person who finds the way they are staging for these press conferences creepy? Am I the only one seeing this? What's with the body language? The body positioning? What are they trying to tell us without words? Things are not for nothing. Visuals have meaning. So what's the meaning? We need to ask that. So let me take a stab at it. I'm sure there are experts in nonverbal communications who can do a better job than I can. But let me use something I know a little bit about. Let me use art. The history of Western art in general, and statues in particular. What I'm referring to is what has become a standard set piece for the press conference. The single figure, standing perfectly straight, facing the camera or crowd, always frontally, staring straight ahead at you. The central figure, the speaker, the leader, the department head, is the largest figure and is clearly meant to be the most important. Viewed from a TV screen or iPhone, the central figure is dominant. We might just let this go. I mean, how else are you going to do a press conference? But let's look behind this guy or woman. Behind, in a row, standing perfectly still, are silent witnesses. Whether masked or unmasked, it makes little difference. They are perfectly still. Obviously, the director is telling them to try to stay as still as possible. Evenly spaced. And this isn't just about COVID, because they are still doing it today. They were doing it before. This style has developed slowly over many years, but it is now firmly entrenched. You may get at most an approving nod out of these zombies in the back row. Otherwise, they stand still and mute. Although sometimes they get their turn at the mic, usually this is all they do. They just stand there. From the perspective of the viewer, they are smaller than the central figure, and thus we are led to understand that these officials are less important, but definitely more important than you. The style appears to be uniform, whether making a political announcement, discussing a national emergency, providing an update on some high-profile crime, or commemorating some event. The consistency is unmistakable. Remarkable, actually. The style cuts across nations and seems global in scope. There are differences, though. It is totally dominant in places like Canada. So I have a lot of Canadian examples in the visuals. I noticed it is a little less common in the UK for some reason. The US uses a lot of the single central figure, but you still see the rows of the zombies behind. And that was also true under Trump. Some places replace the mute zombies with the dominant sign language interpreter, which serves, I think, a similar purpose. My guess is the more totalitarian the country, the more controlled are the press conferences, and the more consistently this particular style is used for reasons I'll explain. By totalitarian, I mean a society that meddles in every aspect of your life and doesn't seem to have any limits into what it will stick its nose into. Now, if you think this is nonsense, look at a press conference here from the 1960s. This is nobody. This is JFK. And yet, note how small he is in the framing. Look behind. A crowd is moving around normally, naturally, interested in what is going on, just like normal people. And look at the people beside JFK. They're sitting naturally, their heads turn, and they assume different sitting postures over time. Conclusion, this is a society which is much less controlled, much less totalitarian. That's my hypothesis. Something has changed in a big way. I haven't heard anyone comment on this. Am I alone? Apparently this doesn't bother most people. A person may not like the speaker or may disagree with whatever policy is being announced, but no one ever says, "Hey, what's with the weird body language? Something is not resonating with me." I find the body language disturbing. The mask, when they wore them, in the back row, quite macabre, creepy, as I said, for reasons that aren't immediately clear, but which my spider sense tells me relates to power and the relationship between the speaker and those meant to receive the message. There is much more being communicated here than a policy statement and the content of the words used by the speaker. The words and emotional tone of delivery are, I suggest, irrelevant. The real message is about power. It seems the row of figures standing perfectly still, fixed, front-facing, evenly spaced, perfectly still and masked is meant to be calming and reassuring to the public, but I'm experiencing quite the opposite. It's making me agitated. This may be that I am outside of the controlled group, so I'm not taking the message properly. What is it in this messaging that I am picking up that others don't seem to see or feel, or are just brushing off as unimportant? For starters, where have I seen this before? My mind turns immediately to the history of sculpture, and specifically to the sculpture of ancient Egypt. Here we can recognize something very familiar in the still, highly controlled, front-facing stiffness of the 1,000-year-old sculptures, which bear, I think, a striking similarity to the pose taken or struck in the modern press conference style preferred by our rulers. Understanding Egyptian art lies in appreciating what it was created for. Ancient Egyptian art must be viewed from the standpoint of the ancient Egyptians, not from our standpoint. What is being communicated in the somewhat static, formal, abstract, and often blocky nature of much of Egyptian statuary? The first mistake is to assume Egyptian art played a similar role in ancient Egypt as art did in ancient Athens, in the Renaissance, or in modern times. Just different. That's not correct. We can admire the beauty of the creations found in King Tut's tomb, but it is important to remember that the majority of these works were never intended to be seen. That was not their purpose. These images of high-status people, whether statues of gods or pharaohs or reliefs on tomb walls, were designed to benefit a divine or deceased recipient. The majority of Egyptian art exhibits frontally. The sizes of figures is not about perspective. It is about importance. The bigger you are, the more important you are. It is not that the slaves or farmers are far away. It's that they are of minimal relative social importance. Servants and slaves, along with animals, were usually shown in smaller scale. This was to clearly define the social hierarchy of a situation. For instance, the pharaoh would be drawn as the largest figure in a painting, no matter where he was situated, and a greater god would be drawn larger than a lesser god. Axiality, basically being on an axis, and proportion and other factors indicate that Egyptian artists had to use mathematics to construct their compositions, according to fixed, inherited conventions. Political and religious, as well as artistic order, was unified and unchanging as their art. Edward Bleiberg, the managing curator of ancient Egyptian, African, and Asian art at the Brooklyn Museum, writes that the depictions aren't just pretty pictures, they're part of the language. In Egyptian hieroglyphics, a string of letters is often followed by a sign called determinative, which has no phonetic value but tells you something more general about the word. Leg determinatives relate to movement. Hills have to do with the land, and men and women come after names, professions, or other words relating to people. Because they're not artistic drawings, but rather symbols of language, the determinatives are less concerned with being anatomically accurate than they are with showcasing all the distinguishing features. Once these conventions were developed, they couldn't change much because they had to remain readily recognizable as language cues. There are no artists in Egypt. The ideal is to copy the sculptures that were originally made by the god Ptah, who invented the sculpture. For example, the classic depiction of the seated king can be found in virtually every dynasty. The pose is the same, as is the idealization of the important figure's appearance. Rulers always appear young and beautiful, but nondescript and clothed. Exceptions to this indicate not experimentation with a form, but low status. Unimportant workers can be naked or old because they do not need to reflect the tradition. While Egyptian statues and artwork that depict figures as static may seem simplistic, without motion, this style allows them to exist outside the realm of time. The Greeks valued art for its ability to capture a single moment in time, whereas the Egyptians idealized timelessness. It's supposed to last forever. Rules also applied to the poses and gestures of the figures to reflect the meaning of what the person was doing. They did not attempt to replicate the real world, but did achieve a level of realism. That is Pharaoh. That is a servant, a boat, or a cow, but within a rigid hierarchical social order. Most formal statues show a prescribed frontality, meaning they are arranged to look straight ahead, because they were designed to face the ritual being performed before them. Frequently, this is a temple or tomb, such as the row of 4 colossal statues of Ramses II outside the main temple at Abu Simbel. They were designed to face the rising sun, so important in Egyptian religion. Statues were set up to take part in the rituals relating to the gods and the pharaoh. Statuary, whether divine, royal, or elite, provided a conduit for the spirit, or Ka, of the represented being to interact with the earthly world below. The reason for this frontality is they were designed not as an art form, but as part of a religious ritual. The Egyptians did not have a word for art, but they had specific words for the art they created, like a statue or a stela or a tomb. Art is then functional within the religion and the social order. The artist's desire was to preserve everything from the present as clearly and permanently as possible. Ancient Egyptian art was designed to represent socio-economic status and a belief system. This and all other generalized representations of pharaohs were not intended to be true portraits, but rather to proclaim the godlike nature of Egyptian kings. Egyptian society and social order that generated its unique art is said to be structured like a pyramid, with the gods and pharaoh at the top, and the society managed by an elite of government officials, nobles, and priests. This is a fixed, stable society without social mobility. As the people of Egypt believed that their rulers were gods, protection was the primary expectation in return for obedience. And doesn't that sound familiar? Let me suggest then that a society that made Egyptian art, or one that looks like Egyptian art, sees itself in the following ways: as a social order that was permanent and unchanging, outside of the political, a timeless present. It is ritualistic and even magical. It is ruled by a powerful elite entrusted with most responsibilities. It is strongly religious or sacramental in nature. It has at its bottom, the bottom of the pyramid, a collective mass that has traded individuality and freedom for total trust, safety, and protection. Let me also suggest that the use of frontality, power proportionality, static, fixed poses, calculated positioning, serves many of the same purposes by the elites setting up these press conferences we started off looking at today. And if so, is this not the body language of a tyranny in plain sight? A tyranny characterized by stiffness, uniformity, sameness, permanence, and a lack of individuality. Of course, there are figures, personalities that this setup can still not help due to certain physical limitations, and other options must be considered. Now back to my question as to how come this bothers so few people. You could say the society had already become receptive to this messaging, as reflected in popular art. That is why so many find it comforting. If it didn't work, they wouldn't have adopted this very rigid style and would have probably kept something that looked a lot more like the JFK press conference we were looking at, and modified it more slowly. You can see this well illustrated in the love in pop music, it seems, for this line of performers gyrating in unison. The frontality, the uniformity, it's already there. Also in the monumentalism of sports and public events, the collective is good, all-powerful, and protective. Jump right in and lose yourself. Compare now the body language of our elites to the sculpture of ancient Greece, to the great democracy of Athens. Rather than the static, the entrenched, and eternal, you have the artist capturing a moment in time, movement, individuality, identity. What we see here is a risky world for daring people who find themselves empowered to act as individuals, to move, to change, who are willing to risk in order to win. Take even those grand portraits of the 18th and 19th century. Even here, you are not seeing the modern total state, or even any hint at its coming. Every pose is different. Every person portrayed is portrayed as having an identity and meant to be understood as a distinct individual among peers. You'll also note that leaders are not portrayed as much larger than the lesser figures, projecting a kind of modesty, humility, a first among equals kind of ideology. This despite the great forces of history of revolution, empire, technology, philosophy, and science shaking the world. We hadn't lost ourselves yet. My, how things have changed. What do we make of our modern elites and their tyranny in plain sight? I think we should take them at their word, so to speak. Their body language is full of meaning. It may not be intentional or overly thought out and planned, and I am 100% positive they have no clue about Egyptian art or know anything about it and didn't imitate it. That is for sure. But like the ancient Egyptians, they are telling us in their body language, in their art, a great deal about the society they have created and who will be in charge.
I'm capable of anything.